The wounded soul behind every addiction. Carl Jung explains there's a question we rarely ask when we see someone addicted to something, whether it's alcohol, drugs, food, gambling, social media, or even attention. We ask, why don't they stop? Or what's wrong with them? But we almost never ask, what pain are they trying to escape? And even more rarely do we ask, what wound are they carrying that makes the addiction feel like medicine? Carl Jung did. He didn't just look at addiction as a medical issue or a moral failure. He looked deeper into the unconscious, into the soul. He believed that behind every compulsive behavior, there's an emotion we haven't learned how to face, a trauma we haven't integrated, a shadow we're still running from. And he said something that, if you really understand it, has the power to change how you see addiction forever. All neurosis is a substitute for legitimate suffering. Let's pause on that. What does it mean? It means that when we don't allow ourselves to suffer consciously, to confront our wounds, our grief, our existential emptiness, we end up suffering unconsciously. Through addiction, through depression, through anxiety, through behaviors we can't explain and habits we can't control. Jung believed that the psyche is always trying to bring us back into wholeness. But when the pain is too great and we lack the tools, the community, or the awareness to face it, we find substitutes. And those substitutes can become prisons. Now imagine this. Someone is scrolling endlessly through their phone, numbing out on videos, dopamine hits, distraction. On the surface, it looks like laziness. But what if it's actually despair? What if the person you see lost in addiction is really trying to avoid the silence, because in that silence, the pain they've buried for years starts to whisper. And once it starts, it doesn't stop. Jung believed that most of us are terrified of that inner voice. Not because it's evil or dangerous, but because it's true. And truth, especially emotional, existential truth, is rarely comfortable. So we run. We run to the bottle, to the casino, to the fridge, to the screen, to the arms of people who don't love us. Not because we're weak, but because we're wounded. Jung didn't pathologize the addict, he empathized with them. He saw addiction as a spiritual problem, a symptom of disconnection from the self. And when he said self, he didn't mean ego. He meant the deepest part of us, the part that holds our purpose, our direction, our wholeness. Addiction, in Jung's view, is the soul's cry for help, a desperate signal that we've become fragmented, that something essential has been lost.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
This is where the idea of the shadow becomes important. Jung defined the shadow as all the parts of ourselves we reject, deny, or repress. Our shame, our rage, our grief, our insecurities. These don't disappear just because we ignore them. They go underground, and then they show up as addiction, not just to substances, but to patterns, to roles, to identities, to anything that allows us to avoid what we don't want to feel. Every addiction is a deal we make with the shadow. If I give you this distraction, will you please leave me alone? But the shadow never leaves us alone. It waits. And the longer we avoid it, the stronger it becomes. Jung warned us, whatever we do not face within ourselves will eventually appear outside us as fate. That's not just poetic, it's a warning. The trauma you don't resolve will show up again and again, in different forms, wearing different masks. And the addiction that once helped you cope with pain will eventually cause pain. It becomes a cycle, one that can only be broken by turning inward. Here's the hard truth. Healing isn't comfortable. It feels like dying. Because in a way it is. You're letting old parts of yourself dissolve, identities formed around pain, beliefs formed in trauma, habits that once protected you but now destroy you. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming your true self. And the first step of that journey is facing your pain without anesthesia. No filters, no distractions, just you, and the truth of what hurts. But how do we begin? How do we even approach the pain we've spent our whole lives avoiding? Jung would say, start by noticing your compulsions. Every time you reach for something out of habit, ask yourself, what am I trying not to feel? When you overeat, is it loneliness? When you scroll for hours, is it boredom or is it existential dread? When you drink, is it celebration or is it grief in disguise? The addiction is never the root. It's the symptom. The real work is to trace it back to find the original wound. And here's where the transformation begins. Because once you identify the wound, something incredible happens. Compassion. You stop seeing yourself as injured. And injuries can heal, but only if we stop pretending they're not there. So here's the ultimate question Jung leaves us with, one that might haunt you in the best possible way. What have you been addicted to, not because it brings you joy, but because it protects you from pain? And are you willing finally to turn toward the pain and listen? The shadows bargain why your pain made a deal with addiction. Every addiction is a contract, a silent, unseen agreement between the conscious self and the unconscious wound. Carl Jung believed that the psyche is not a straight line, it's a labyrinth, a living structure of symbols, archetypes, memories, and instincts, all interacting in ways that modern psychology still struggles to fully understand. But one thing Jung saw clearly is that when we are overwhelmed by pain, especially in childhood or during emotionally formative years, we don't just move on, we adapt. And that adaptation often takes the form of survival mechanisms that become addictions later in life. Why is this? Because the psyche, when overwhelmed, will do anything to preserve itself. If the pain is too intense, too shameful, or too confusing to process consciously, the unconscious steps in and says, "Let me carry this." It buries the trauma deep in the shadow, where it can't disrupt our daily life. But the shadow doesn't bury things for free. It demands payment. An addiction becomes the price we pay for not facing our truth. Think of it like this. The shadow offers a bargain. I'll keep your pain hidden, it says, but in return you must feed me. Feed me distraction. Feed me pleasure. Feed me numbness. Feed me anything that keeps you from waking up and realizing how much you've buried. And we agree, not consciously, but emotionally. We agree every time we choose the path of least resistance. Every time we seek comfort over courage. Every time we silence the voice inside that says, "This isn't who I really am." Jung didn't see this bargain as evil, he saw it as tragic. Because what starts as protection eventually becomes a prison. The addiction that once saved us becomes the very thing that destroys us. And the longer we avoid facing the shadow, the more control it gains. We start to identify with our addiction. We say, "I am an addict," rather than "I am someone in pain." We let the behavior define us when in reality, it was always just the symptom of something deeper, something sacred, something human. Here's the part we often miss. The shadow isn't trying to ruin us. It's trying to protect us, but it's using primitive tools. It doesn't care about your long-term growth. It cares about your immediate survival. And survival, in the short term, often means avoidance. But you weren't born just to survive. You were born to individuate, to become whole. And wholeness requires integration. It requires us to go into the shadow, retrieve the wounded parts of ourselves, and bring them into the light, not to destroy them, but to understand them. Jung taught that what we resist persists. The more we deny our shadow, the louder it knocks. And addiction is one of its loudest knocks. It's how the unconscious says, "You've been gone too long. It's time to come home." But coming home isn't easy. It means revisiting the original wound. The moment we felt unloved, the moment we were abandoned, humiliated, violated, or ignored. It means acknowledging that the addiction wasn't random, it was a response to pain we didn't choose, but which shaped us anyway. And this brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth Jung ever offered. Healing doesn't begin by fixing the addiction. It begins by honoring the pain that caused it. You can remove the substance, break the habit, block the website, throw away the bottle, but if you don't address the emotional contract beneath it, the shadow will find a new currency. The addiction will morph, evolve, change its costume, because the contract is still in place. So what do? We renegotiate. We go to the part of us that made the original deal, the wounded inner child, the abandoned teenager, the exhausted adult, and we say, you don't have to carry this alone anymore. We don't fight the shadow. We befriend it. We listen to it. We thank it for protecting us when no one else did. And in doing so, we begin to release it. Ask yourself now, what is the contract your addiction made? What bargain have you kept alive because you were too afraid to break it? And what would happen if you stopped feeding the shadow and started hearing it instead? Because maybe the addiction isn't the enemy, maybe it's the message. And maybe your healing begins the moment you stop trying to silence that message and start decoding it. The archetype of the healer, how your inner wound becomes your power. Carl Jung was not only a psychologist, he was a mythologist of the soul. He believed that every human life is a living myth, unfolding through archetypes, universal patterns that shape our psyche, our choices, our suffering, and our transformation. Among these, one of the most powerful and paradoxical is the wounded healer. It is the idea that the very place you are broken is the place where your greatest strength can emerge. That your wound, the one you've spent years hiding, numbing, escaping from, that is not your shame. It is your path, your purpose, your portal to transcendence. And in the context of addiction, this insight is revolutionary. What if the thing that once destroyed you could become the thing that defines your rebirth? What if the pain that led you to addiction was never a curse, but a calling? Jung saw healing not as returning to a previous state, but as a transformation. He said, "You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become." And in that statement lies the entire philosophy of the wounded healer. The addict who rises from the ashes of their suffering doesn't just recover, they awaken. They carry a depth of empathy, a sensitivity to the suffering of others, a wisdom that cannot be taught through books or theories, but only through lived experience. The wound becomes the teacher. But here's the paradox. You cannot become a healer if you skip your own healing. You cannot guide others through darkness if you have not made peace with your own. Jung warned against what he called the inflation of the ego in the healing process, the temptation to bypass the hard work of inner integration by adopting a healer identity too soon. This is how some people move from one addiction to another, from substances to savior complexes, from escapism to spiritual superiority. But real healing is humbling. It is not glamorous. It is not quick. It is a slow, painful descent into the parts of ourselves we've disowned, followed by a long, courageous return. And yet, for all its difficulty, healing is not punishment. It is initiation. It is the rebirth of the self from within the ruins of the false self, what Jung called the persona, the mask we wear to survive. When the addiction begins to fall away, what's left is not an empty space, it's possibility. It's a blank canvas. And on that canvas, you begin to paint the life that was always meant to be lived, not the life driven by escape, but the life fueled by awareness, by truth, by passion born from pain. Jung believed that the unconscious doesn't just contain our darkness, it also contains our gifts. The parts of us we've never dared to express, the talents we've repressed, the truths we've buried under shame. And addiction, ironically, often points directly to those buried gifts. The person addicted to intensity may be a repressed artist. The one addicted to control may be a natural leader who was never allowed to lead. The one addicted to approval may be a wounded sage, born to teach but afraid to speak. The addiction is not random, it's often a distorted echo of our true nature, crying out to be reclaimed. So what if, instead of asking, how do I stop this addiction, we asked, what is this addiction trying to reveal? What truth have I silenced that now screams through compulsion? What part of me have I disowned that is now demanding to be seen? This is where the wounded healer archetype becomes not just a concept, but a mirror. It asks us to look at our pain not as an obstacle, but as a map. Every scar has a story. And every story, when told with honesty and courage, becomes medicine not just for you, but for others. Because here's the secret, your healing isn't just personal, it's collective. When you face your wound, you don't just liberate yourself, you create a path for others to follow. You become the light in someone else's darkness. You become the proof that transformation is possible. And isn't that the deepest purpose of suffering? Not to destroy us, but to remake us, to break the illusion of separateness, to reconnect us to our own soul and to the souls of others. So ask yourself now, what is the greatest pain you've ever endured? What if that pain holds the seed of your greatest gift? And what if the very thing you thought disqualified you from healing others is the exact thing that qualifies you most? Becoming whole, why integration, not perfection, is the end of addiction. We often think of healing as becoming perfect, clean, pure, free of flaws, free of cravings, finally in control. But that illusion is a trap, and Carl Jung would be the first to dismantle it. He never promised perfection. He never even believed in it. For Jung, the goal of healing was not to become flawless, but to become whole. Wholeness is not the absence of darkness. It is the capacity to hold both light and dark within you without being torn apart. And that's where real transformation happens, not when you eliminate your shadow, but when you integrate it. What does integration really mean? It means that instead of trying to kill off the parts of you that once led you to addiction, you invite them to the table. You get curious. You listen. You ask those inner voices, why did you show up? What were you trying to protect? What need were you trying to meet? And you learn to meet those needs in new ways that nourish you rather than destroy you. This is radical work. It's not about discipline alone. It's about understanding. It's about compassion. And it's about responsibility, not in the punishing sense, but in the empowering one. The moment you stop fighting parts of yourself and start taking responsibility for them is the moment you begin to heal on a level that addiction can never touch. Jung saw the psyche as a self-regulating system. When we repress something, it doesn't disappear, it gets projected. It finds ways to manifest. And addiction is one of the clearest projections of unintegrated parts of the self. So when we remove the addiction without doing the inner work, the psyche just finds another outlet. That's why people often trade one addiction for another: alcohol for workaholism, drugs for toxic relationships, social media for spiritual bypassing. The underlying wound hasn't been integrated. It's just wearing a new costume. Integration, on the other hand, brings peace. Not because the cravings vanish overnight, but because you're no longer split against yourself. You stop living in fragments. You begin to feel the coherence of your soul again. And from that coherence comes clarity. You begin to see choices where before there were only compulsions. You begin to respond instead of react. You begin to live not from the wound, but from the wisdom the wound gave you. But let's be honest, integration is not glamorous. It's messy, it's slow, it doesn't come with applause. No one sees the quiet moments when you choose to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. No one celebrates the night you cry on the floor instead of numbing out. No one gives you a trophy for telling the truth about your pain. But those are the moments that build a new foundation. That's the work behind the work, and it's sacred. Jung believed that the journey of individuation, the process of becoming your true self, is the highest goal of human life. And that journey always includes a descent into the underworld of the psyche. You must meet your monsters. You must face your shame. You must walk through the fire of your own story. But when you do, you emerge not as someone who has integrated it all. And that person is unshakable. Not because they are perfect, but because they are real. So maybe the end of addiction isn't about fixing yourself. Maybe it's about finding yourself. Not the version of you that performs for approval or hides behind habits or fears their own pain, but the version that remembers who you were before the world told you who to be. The version that knows how to hold complexity, contradiction, and emotion without collapsing. Ask yourself now, what if the goal isn't to be free from your past, but to become so intimate with it that nothing it contains can control you anymore? What would your life look like if you stopped trying to be perfect and instead became whole? Because in the end, that's what healing really is. Not a war against yourself, not a desperate chase for purity, but a return to the self you abandoned when the pain became too much. A return to the soul behind the addiction. A return to the truth you were always meant to carry. And that return? That's not the end of the journey. It's the beginning.